Two patients crashed at the same second. Not one, two. Flatlined simultaneously in adjacent bays, and the entire emergency department of Hargrove Regional Medical Center stopped breathing with them. Monitors screamed. Residents froze mid-step. The charge nurse dropped a clipboard. And while 14 trained medical professionals stood paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what was happening, one person was already moving. The quiet travel nurse everyone called dead weight. The woman Dr. Preston Holt had humiliated in front of staff just 3 hours earlier. She had a crash cart on Bay 2 before anyone else remembered where the paddles were kept. Before this story goes any further, if you've never seen a quiet person dismantle an entire room without raising their voice, you're about to. Subscribe to this channel right now, hit that notification bell, and stay with me until the very last word, because what happens inside Hargrove Regional over the next 72 hours will redefine everything you think you know about strength. And when you're done watching, drop a comment. Tell me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Let's begin. Silver Falls. Wyoming was the kind of town that believed it already knew everything it needed to know about a person within the first 2 weeks. Population 43,000, one major employer, one hospital, and a social structure built almost entirely on who had been there longest. Outsiders were tolerated. They were never trusted. Claire Merritt had arrived on a 12-week travel nursing contract in the middle of February, driving a truck with Montana plates and carrying 2 duffel bags and a cardboard box of medical references she'd owned for years. She was 34 years old, white, lean in the way people get when they've spent extended periods somewhere food wasn't guaranteed, with close-cropped brown hair and a habit of standing slightly apart from groups. Not antisocially, just watchfully, the way someone stands when they've learned that positioning matters. Hargrove Regional Medical Center was a Level 2 trauma facility, which meant it handled serious cases but transferred anything truly catastrophic to the larger system 60 miles east. The ER ran hard on weekends and had a reputation for being understaffed, which was why they'd brought in travel nurses at all. The permanent staff had not been enthusiastic about the arrangement. Dr. Preston Holt had made his position clear on Claire's 3rd day. He was the chief of emergency medicine. 51 years old, silver-haired, the kind of physician who had spent so long being deferred to that he'd forgotten the difference between authority and correctness. He'd found Claire reviewing a patient chart at the nurse's station and had taken the chart from her hand without asking. "Travel staff review charts when they're assigned a patient," he'd said. "Not before." "I was assigned that patient," Claire had told him, 20 minutes ago. "Then you should already know what's in the chart." He'd walked away. She had not responded. Several permanent nurses had watched the exchange with expressions ranging from sympathy to the particular satisfaction people feel when someone else absorbs a blow they've been living under for years. That was day 3. By week 6, it had become a pattern. Holt corrected her in public. He redirected family members who asked her questions to find one of the actual staff. In a team briefing the previous month, he'd referred to the travel nurses collectively as rotating bodies. And when a resident named Dr. Anaya Osei had quietly pointed out that this was demeaning, Holt had smiled and said, "Medicine is demeaning. That's how you know it's real." Claire absorbed it all and said almost nothing. She worked her shifts. She learned the layout of the supply rooms faster than most nurses who'd been there 2 years. She noticed which residents second-guessed themselves and which ones overcorrected, and she adjusted how she communicated with each accordingly. She developed a quiet reputation among the nursing staff. Not a loud one, not a celebrated one, just the kind where people started routing certain questions her way because they'd noticed she was usually right. Her hands shook sometimes. This was the thing people noticed and cataloged and used to define her. Not dramatically, not a tremor anyone could point to as incapacitating, but visible under fluorescent light, especially after long hours or high-stress moments. Holt had noticed during her first week and had mentioned it to the nursing director, Renata Kowalski, in a tone that suggested it was a safety concern rather than the commentary it actually was. Renata had reviewed Claire's file, found nothing actionable, and told Holt there was nothing to act on. He had remained unimpressed. What nobody at Hargrove Regional knew, what Claire had not told anyone, had not been asked, had not volunteered, was why her hands sometimes shook, or where she'd been before Silver Falls, or what the 12-week contract represented, for her, beyond a paycheck. She was trying to rebuild something, She was not ready to talk about what she was rebuilding it from. The morning of March 14th began without distinction. Claire started her shift at 6, took handoff from the night nurse on 4 patients, reviewed charts, administered medications on schedule, and was in the middle of recalibrating a drip rate when the radio chatter started. She heard it through the triage desk speakers, county dispatch, clipped and fast, the kind of voice that had already processed the shock and moved into logistics. A construction crew working on the Kellerman Road overpass had experienced a partial collapse. Steel decking, concrete formwork, 3 workers confirmed fallen, multiple others injured. First responders were on scene. EMS inbound with at minimum 6 patients, possibly more. Hargrove Regional activated its mass casualty protocol. The ER charge nurse, a woman named Bridget Tully, who had been running emergency departments for 19 years, began directing the controlled chaos with the efficiency of someone who had done exactly this before. Rooms were cleared. Crash carts were checked. Residents were assigned. Holt arrived in trauma scrubs 12 minutes after the first radio call, took position at the center of the department, and began issuing directives. He looked at Claire once, briefly, and assigned her to triage support. Triage support meant she would help sort incoming patients by severity. Important work, not glamorous work, and typically assigned to nurses he considered less critical to the resuscitation bays. She accepted the assignment without comment and moved to the ambulance bay. The first 2 rigs arrived together, 4 patients between them. Claire moved down the line of gurneys with methodical speed, checking airways, assessing breathing, looking at skin color and responsiveness, and the way people held themselves when they were in pain. The paramedics were talking fast. She listened to all of it simultaneously while her hands moved. The second patient from the first rig was a man in his mid-40s, a foreman named, according to the EMS sheet, as Dale Purcell. He was conscious, complaining loudly about his right arm, and had a tourniquet applied above the elbow. The tourniquet was the problem. Claire could see it was positioned incorrectly, applied too loosely, which meant it was compressing the superficial structures but not the deep ones, which meant Purcell was still losing blood at a rate that the tight bandaging below was masking. He'd looked stable until he wasn't. She corrected the tourniquet placement, repositioned it 2 inches higher, tightened it properly. Purcell cursed loudly. She told him that was appropriate and moved on. The third patient was younger, maybe 25, barely responsive. Crush injury to the chest, breath sounds diminished on the left. Claire pressed 2 fingers against his trachea and felt the deviation, subtle, easy to miss if you were looking for dramatic presentations. She wasn't looking for dramatic presentations. She'd seen what happens when this particular injury goes unaddressed for 15 minutes, and it is not a presentation anyone forgets. She called for a chest decompression kit. The paramedic next to her hesitated. "That's a physician order," he said. "Then get me a physician, right now." Dr. Osei appeared at the ambulance bay door 40 seconds later, assessed the patient in 12 seconds, and ordered the decompression herself. Claire performed the needle thoracentesis with hands that did not shake. The patient's oxygen saturation, which had been dropping, stabilized within 90 seconds. Osei looked at Claire for a moment longer than necessary, then moved back inside. The wave of patients continued. 7, then 9, then 12. The ER absorbed them the way emergency departments do. Not gracefully, not without friction, but with the grim functional efficiency of a system that exists precisely for this kind of overload. Rooms filled, voices overlapped. The supply of IV supplies at the trauma station ran low, and someone had to know where the backup stock was kept, and that someone turned out to be Claire because she'd memorized the supply room layout in week 2 and nobody had noticed. She was moving through the corridor with restocked supplies when she heard it. Not an alarm, not a loud sound, but a specific absence. The quality of silence in Bay 4 changed. She processed it before she consciously understood it, was already moving before her mind caught up with why. The patient in Bay 4 was a construction worker named Terrence Bly, 51 years old, admitted for what the intake sheet listed as a moderate head laceration and possible fractured ribs. He had been stable on arrival. He was no longer stable. His monitor showed a rhythm Claire recognized as a precursor to ventricular fibrillation, not VFib itself, not yet, but the particular sequence of aberrant beats that preceded it in cardiac contusion cases. She was at the crash cart before the alarm fully sounded. The resident assigned to Bay 4, a third-year named Marcus Whelan, came through the door 20 seconds after her. He saw the rhythm. He reached for the defibrillator. Claire put her hand on his arm. "Not yet," she said. "He's still perfusing. If you shock him now, you'll push him into full arrest. Get me amiodarone, 200 milligrams IV push, and have the paddles ready." Whelan looked at the monitor, looked at her. I was 29 years old and had been doing this for 3 years, and he knew she was right, which was the most disorienting part. He got the amiodarone. The rhythm stabilized 6 minutes later. Bly's blood pressure came up. He was transferred to the cardiac care unit without ever fully arresting. Whelan did not say thank you. He said, "Where did you train?" in a tone that suggested the answer would recontextualize something for him. Claire said, "Various places," and walked out. It was 40 minutes later, in the relative lull that follows the acute phase of a mass casualty event, that the monitors in Bay 2 and Bay 6 alarmed simultaneously. 2 patients, 2 flatlines, 2 separate rooms, 2 separate injuries, 2 separate physiological crises converging on the same 30-second window. The department did not freeze for long, professionals can't, but there was a fractional hesitation, that half-beat where the human brain processes an impossible data point before the trained response catches up. Which room? Which patient? How do you split? Claire was already in Bay 2. She didn't decide to go there. She had been closest, had read both patients when they came in, had kept a portion of her attention on Bay 2 because the injury pattern had made her uneasy. She had the airway established before the first resident pushed through the door. In Bay 6, Holt himself was running the resuscitation. Both patients came back. Bay 2 took 4 minutes. Bay 6 took 6. When the immediate crisis resolved, Claire was standing at the nurse's station updating the Bay 2 chart when she became aware that the department had gone quieter than the situation warranted. She looked up. Several of the permanent nurses were watching her. Whelan was watching her. Renata Kowalski, who had come down from administration during the mass casualty activation and had not yet left, was watching her. Holt was watching her from across the room with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not hostility, not the particular brand of casual contempt he'd been wearing since February. Something closer to recalibration, the look of someone who has just discovered that the map they've been using is significantly wrong. She held his gaze for a moment, then went back to the chart. Bridget Tully appeared at her elbow 20 minutes later, sliding into the space beside her with the practiced ease of someone who had been navigating tight hospital corridors for 2 decades. She didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there. "Bay 2, Tully finally said. "That patient, you knew before the monitor showed it." "The rhythm was trending," Claire said. "If you watch the waveform for long enough." "I've been watching waveforms for 19 years, Merritt." Tully's voice was not unkind. It was just precise. "Where did you actually come from?" Claire was quiet. "That's what I figured," Tully said, and walked away. The afternoon folded into early evening. The mass casualty patients were distributed to appropriate units or discharged. The ER returned to its standard controlled chaos. Claire finished her shift documentation, changed out of her scrubs, and was pulling on her jacket in the locker room when Renata Kowalski knocked and pushed the door open without waiting for an answer. "Dr. Holt wants a meeting," Renata said. "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Claire had heard that phrase before. In different buildings, from different people, but the same phrase. The meeting was never about what they said it was about. The meeting was always about the fact that something had happened that disturbed the established order, and the established order needed to reassert itself. "What's the meeting about?" she asked anyway. "He wants to review your credentialing documentation." Renata's expression was carefully neutral. "There are some questions about your previous work history, specifically some gaps." There it was. "My contract is through Meridian Staffing," Claire said. "All my credentialing goes through them." "There are questions Hargrove needs to answer independently." Claire zipped her jacket. "Fine. 8 o'clock. She drove back to the extended stay motel on Route 9 where she'd been living since February. Room 114. Ground floor, corner unit. Positioned so the window faced the parking lot, and the door faced the interior corridor. Not a choice she'd made consciously, exactly, but not an accident either. She made coffee on the small electric kettle she'd brought with her, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at the wall. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when she was alone. She'd known honestly that this was a possibility. The gaps in her documented work history weren't explainable by anything a normal CV could contain. She'd managed it through the staffing agency because Meridian's credentialing process had certain parameters she'd been able to work within, and because the people who had helped her build her civilian documentation had been careful and thorough. But a direct hospital audit, done by someone determined enough to dig past the surface. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Unknown number. Wyoming area code, but she didn't recognize it specifically. She answered, Claire Merritt. Not a question. A male voice, older, accustomed to being listened to. She didn't say anything. This is Commander Darren Vaught, Naval Special Operations Medical Command. I need you to listen carefully. We have a situation that requires your specific background. We've been looking for you for 8 months. The coffee was getting cold. She could hear the highway outside, trucks mostly, the low continuous sound of a road that didn't sleep. I think you have the wrong number, she said. Senior Chief Reeves, the voice said. Andy Reeves. Combat Medic. Expeditionary Medical Unit 7. Officially listed as killed in action 22 months ago, following the Draven Protocol operation. She was quiet for a long time. We need to talk, Vaught said. In person. Tonight. Through the window, in the parking lot of the Route 9 Extended Stay Motel, a dark SUV was idling under the floodlight. Engine running, no plates visible from this angle. It had not been there when she arrived. She stood at the window for 11 seconds. She counted them, not deliberately, just the way her brain had always processed threat assessment, automatically converting uncertainty into measurable units. The SUV hadn't moved. The engine was still running, exhaust visible in the cold March air, rising and dispersing under the floodlight in slow curls. She pulled on her boots without sitting down. The SUV was a black Suburban, government plates she could now read from the doorway. Not Wyoming, not any civilian agency she recognized on sight. A man in a dark jacket was leaning against the passenger side with his arms crossed, and when she pushed through the exterior door of the motel corridor and walked toward him across the wet asphalt, he didn't move to intercept her or reach for anything. He just watched her come. Commander Vaught, she said. Not a question. No. He was younger than the voice on the phone. 30s, close-cropped hair, the particular stillness of someone who had spent significant time in environments where stillness was a survival skill. Vaught's inside. I'm his driver, Petty Officer Delgado. He opened the rear passenger door without ceremony. She looked at the open door, looked at him. If I get in that vehicle, she said, what happens to my truck? He blinked. Clearly not the question he'd been expecting. We'll have someone move it to a secure lot. Keys? She thought about it for 2 seconds, genuinely weighed it, because the truck had everything she owned in it that mattered, then handed him the keys and got in. The man in the back seat was older, 60, maybe 62, with a face that had spent too many years in difficult climates, and the kind of posture that meant he had stopped trying to look relaxed a long time ago. He was in civilian clothes, dark jacket, no insignia, but the bearing was unmistakable. You could put a career military officer in a bathrobe and they would still sit like that. Senior Chief Reeves, he said. Merritt, she said. I've been Merritt for 22 months. You can use that. Vaught studied her for a moment. Then he nodded, once, as if granting something. Merritt, then. For now. Delgado got in the front and pulled out of the lot without being told. They headed east on Route 9, away from town, and the interior of the Suburban was quiet except for road noise. Vaught had a tablet on his knee, but he hadn't opened it yet. How did you find me? She asked. Slowly, Vaught said. 8 months of slowly. The short answer is that a medical oversight analyst in Cheyenne flagged an anomalous pattern in travel nursing licensure renewals. Someone whose documented training history didn't quite match their demonstrated clinical skill set. She thought it was a forged credential situation. Referred it to the state board. The state board investigator ran the fingerprints from your initial licensing application. Claire was quiet. The prints matched a set in a classified DoD personnel file, Vaught continued, which flagged my office, which is how we got here. He paused. You were careful. The documentation was very good, but fingerprints are fingerprints. What do you want? She said. He opened the tablet, turned it toward her. The screen showed a photograph. A man in his late 30s, dark hair, several days of growth on his jaw, and what looked like field gear. The image quality suggested it had been taken from a distance with a good lens. The man in the photo was looking at something off-frame, his expression concentrated, a small vertical crease between his brows that she recognized because she had seen it before on the same face. Her chest did something she didn't let show on her face. "Garrett Lund," Vaught said. "You know him." "When was that taken?" 19 days ago. A surveillance asset in the Kessler Flat region, about 70 miles northwest of where we're sitting right now. Vaught pulled the tablet back. "He disappeared 11 days ago. We believe he's alive, but we have no confirmation. We lost contact when his extraction window closed and he didn't appear." She looked out the window at the dark highway, scrub and fence line and the occasional distant light of a ranch property set back from the road. "Garrett Lund is a civilian now," she said. "Technically. Either he is or he isn't. He's separated from service 14 months ago," Vaught said. "He's been conducting independent investigative work since then, specifically into the events surrounding Operation Draven Protocol." A pause. "Your operation?" She turned back from the window. "He went in voluntarily," Vaught said. "He was tracking financial records connected to a former naval officer named Callum Bryce. Bryce left service 8 years ago under pressure, but without prosecution. Lund believed, and the evidence he'd assembled before he went dark suggests he was correct, that Bryce was the individual who sold the operational coordinates for Draven Protocol to a third party. She'd known that. Not known it the way you know something you can prove. Known it the way you know something when you've had 22 months of very quiet, very isolated nights to think about the only explanation that made the events of one evening make sense. The operation had been clean. The team was solid. The security protocols had been followed. The only way the extraction point could have been compromised was if someone with access to the operational planning had provided it intentionally. 3 people had died at that extraction point. She had not been among them because she'd taken a different route, a deviation she'd made on instinct when something felt wrong about the primary corridor, a choice that had saved her life, and for which she'd spent 22 months carrying a specific flavor of guilt that didn't have a clean name. "Bryce," she said. "He's been operating a private security consultation firm in this region for the past 4 years," Vaught said. "The Kessler Flat compound is registered as a training facility. On paper, it's legitimate. In practice, Lund's research suggested it's been used for significantly less legitimate purposes, specifically as a hub for information brokering. And Garrett went in alone. He had an exit plan. The exit plan failed." Vaught closed the tablet. "We can get a team into the compound's perimeter. We have a workable entry point on the northern side. What we cannot do is go in blind regarding the medical situation. Lund has been held for 11 days. We don't know what kind of shape he's in." She looked at him. "I want a combat medic on the extraction team," Vaught said. "Someone who can assess and stabilize in the field without slowing the team down. Someone who has operated in close-quarters environments and won't freeze when the situation deteriorates." He held her gaze. "Someone who has already done this, and who has a personal stake in getting it right." "You want me to go into an active hostile environment," she said. 22 months out of any operational context, as a travel nurse working a 12-week contract in Wyoming. "I want Andy Reeves," Vaught said. "What she's been calling herself for the last 2 years is her own business." The SUV moved through the dark. Outside, the wind was picking up. She could feel it in the slight lateral push on the vehicle, the particular way the high plains announce incoming weather. "What's the timeline?" she said. 48 hours, possibly less. If Lund is injured and the compound doesn't have medical resources." Vaught didn't finish that sentence. He didn't need to. She thought about Garrett Lund's face in that surveillance photograph. The concentration, the slight frown, the expression of someone working through a problem they hadn't yet solved. She'd last seen him in person 14 months before his separation from service, at a nondescript debrief facility in a city she wasn't going to think about right now. He'd looked at her across a conference table with an expression she hadn't had the capacity to process at the time and had filed away somewhere she hadn't opened since. "I have a meeting at the hospital tomorrow morning," she said. 8 o'clock, credentialing review." Vaught's expression didn't change. "We can manage that." "I'm not asking you to manage it. I'm telling you I'll be at the hospital at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, and whatever happens in that meeting will happen. And when it's done, I will call this number." She held up the phone she'd answered 2 hours ago. "And we'll discuss the specifics." He looked at her for a moment. She got the sense he was revising something, some assessment he'd made before she got in the car. "All right," he said. They drove her back to the motel. Her truck was already gone. Delgado handed her a key card for a different room. "Same building, third floor, more secure sight lines," he said, which she didn't argue with. And she spent the rest of the night in a chair by the window with the lights off, not sleeping, which wasn't unusual, thinking about a compound 70 miles northwest and a man who'd been inside it for 11 days. The 8 o'clock meeting was in a small conference room on the administrative floor of Hargrove Regional, the kind of room with a round table and too many chairs and a whiteboard that hadn't been erased completely, old marker outlines of organizational charts still visible behind the current agenda. Holt was already seated when she arrived. So was Renata Kowalski, and a third person she didn't recognize, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a lanyard and an open laptop, who was introduced as Beverly Murch, the hospital's legal credentialing consultant. Claire sat across from them and folded her hands on the table. Holt started talking. He laid out, in careful clinical language, a series of what he called discrepancies in Claire Merritt's documented work history. There was a gap of 14 months between her last verifiable nursing position and her current contract. Her listed references from a hospital in Billings had been slow to verify. One contact had not responded at all. Her training certifications were current and valid, but the institution listed as the source of her advanced trauma certification had undergone a name change and merger, making direct verification difficult. None of what he was saying was wrong, exactly. It was all accurate. The documentation she'd been operating under was genuinely imperfect, and Holt had apparently spent some portion of the previous evening identifying the imperfections. She gave him credit for the thoroughness, even while understanding that thoroughness was not the actual motivation. "The concern," Beverly Murch said, in a tone calibrated to sound neutral, "is that Hargrove Regional may have taken on a nursing staff member without fully completing due diligence." "Meridian staffing completed the due diligence," Claire said. "That's what staffing agencies are for. Hargrove is ultimately responsible for the clinical staff operating in this facility," Murch said. "Then Hargrove should have reviewed Meridian's process before signing the contract." Holt's jaw tightened slightly. "Ms. Merritt," he said, "and the formality of it, the deliberate deprofessionalization, nurse to layperson in a single title shift, was precise and intentional. We're not here to assign blame for the contracting process. We're here because there are questions about your background that need answers." "What answers would satisfy you?" she asked. A pause. Murch looked at her laptop. Kowalski looked at her hands. Holt looked at Claire with the expression of someone who had expected more resistance and wasn't quite sure how to handle the absence of it. "We'd need verification of the 14-month gap," Murch said. "Employment records, tax documentation, anything establishing a continuous documented history." "I was dealing with a family medical situation," Claire said. "I don't have formal employment records for that period." "That's what concerns us." The room was quiet. Outside in the hallway, someone was pushing a cart. The specific squeak of a wheel that needed maintenance, something she'd been hearing for weeks without anyone addressing it. Holt leaned forward slightly. "Yesterday was a remarkable day," he said. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't notice what you did, but remarkable performance doesn't resolve a credentialing gap. If anything—" He stopped. "If anything," she said, "it raises the question of where the skill comes from." He looked at her directly. Yes. She understood in that moment that this meeting had two functions simultaneously. One was the institutional function, Hargrove Regional protecting itself from liability. The other was Holt's personal function, which was to reassert a hierarchy that the previous day's events had visibly disrupted. He needed to put her back in the category she'd occupied before the bridge collapse. He needed her to be the nervous travel nurse again, because the alternative was a restructuring of his understanding of the department that he wasn't prepared to undertake. She could have said something then. She had information that would have ended the meeting in 30 seconds. Instead, she said, "I'll contact Meridian staffing today and ask them to resubmit the full credentialing package directly to Ms. Murch. If there are remaining gaps after that, we can meet again." Murch nodded and wrote something. Holt looked like he'd expected a different outcome. "In the meantime," he said, "I'm recommending that your duties be limited to non-critical patient contact until the credentialing review is complete." There it was. Define non-critical, she said. Routine patient care, no trauma bay assignments, no resuscitation participation without direct physician oversight. She looked at him for a moment. Thought about a compound 70 miles northwest. Thought about 11 days. Fine, she said, and stood up. Kowalski followed her into the hallway. Not immediately. She let Holt leave the room first, let a minute pass, then appeared at Claire's elbow with the practiced timing of someone who had been navigating institutional politics for long enough to know when to create distance. He's not wrong about the liability issue, Kowalski said quietly. I know, but I've been running nursing operations for 16 years, and I know what I watched yesterday. A pause. The decompression. Bay 4. The double code. That's not something you pick up at a community hospital in Montana. Claire looked at the wall. I'm not asking you to explain it, Kowalski said. I'm just telling you I see it. She started to turn away, then stopped. The meeting with Beverly Murch. She's going to pull your fingerprints from the original licensing application. It's standard for identity verification in a contested credentialing situation. I've seen it happen twice before. Another pause. I thought you should know. She walked back toward the nursing office and didn't look back. Claire stood in the hallway for a moment. The cart with the squeaky wheel went past again, someone making a second loop. She watched it go, and then she went to find a private corner of the break room and called the number on her phone. Vaught picked up on the second ring. They're going to pull fingerprints, she said, from the licensing file, probably within 24 hours. A silence on his end, brief but textured. That changes the timeline. I know. Can you be ready by tonight? She thought about what being ready meant and what she was being ready for, and the specific quality of the silence in a room where 11 days of captivity had been endured by someone who had gone in voluntarily to find the truth about 3 dead people. Yes, she said. She finished her shift on the restricted duty assignment, routine patient care. Nothing critical, which was genuinely difficult in a working emergency department because critical situations don't schedule themselves around credentialing disputes. She managed it by being efficient enough with the non-critical work that she remained available at the edges when something acute developed and Holt wasn't in the immediate vicinity to enforce the restriction. Bridget Tully watched this happen twice and said nothing, which was its own form of communication. At 6:15 in the evening, she clocked out, changed, and drove the replacement vehicle Vaught's people had left for her, a gray pickup, unremarkable, full tank, to a property 12 miles east of Silver Falls, that turned out to be a working cattle operation with a large equipment barn that had been modified quietly and recently for a different purpose than storing tractors. There were 5 other people in the barn when she arrived. She assessed them the way she assessed any room she walked into, quickly, without obvious scrutiny, building a picture from posture and positioning and the particular way people who have operated together orient themselves in shared space. 4 of them had that quality. The 5th, a woman about Claire's age with red hair pulled back and the kind of careful blankness that read as someone actively choosing not to show fatigue, was introduced as Petra Walsh, the team lead. Vaught was there too, at a folding table covered in maps and aerial imagery. We have a confirmation, he said when she reached the table. Lund is alive as of this afternoon. A surveillance drone got thermal imagery of the eastern wing of the compound, one signature isolated from the others, consistent with someone who is incapacitated rather than mobile. He paused. Consistent with someone who has been isolated for 11 days and has an injury we can't characterize from thermal alone. She looked at the aerial imagery. The compound was a set of 4 low buildings arranged in a rough rectangle, set back from a gravel road, with a vehicle bay on the western end and what the overhead markings identified as a communications array on the roof of the largest structure. The eastern wing, where Lund's thermal signature had been located, was partially below grade, built into a slope. Harder to see from the road, harder to approach from most directions. Northern perimeter entry, Walsh said, coming to stand beside Claire without preamble. There's a gap in the sensor coverage between these 2 points. She indicated 2 spots on the image. It's not a large gap. 12 minutes, maybe 14. We go in fast, stay contained, get to the eastern wing, assess the casualty, and extract along the southern vehicle track. What's the expected resistance? 6 to 8 personnel. Bryce rotates staff, but there's a core of 4 who are always on site. Walsh met her eyes. These are not untrained individuals. I understand. Can you operate in that environment? Honestly, it was a reasonable question. She didn't take offense at it. If you stay out of my way when I'm working on him, Claire said. Yes. Walsh studied her for another second, nodded. Good enough. They went over the plan for 2 hours. She asked questions about the Eastern Wing's layout, about the structural features that would affect a rapid medical assessment, about the available extraction equipment, and what she'd have to work with in the field. The answers were not all satisfying. There were gaps, things they simply didn't know about the interior, about Lund's specific condition, about how 11 days of captivity in March in Wyoming had affected a man who was, even at his baseline, not someone who showed injury easily. At 10 o'clock that night, they loaded into 2 vehicles and drove northwest into the dark. She sat in the back of the second vehicle, the medical kit across her knees, and watched the landscape go by. The flat scrub giving way to rougher terrain, the sky enormous and very clear, the stars dense in the way they only get far enough from any city that the light pollution loses its reach. She'd grown up in rural Pennsylvania, far enough out that the sky looked like this on clear nights. She hadn't thought about that in years. The team leader in her vehicle, a quiet man named Otis Farrow, didn't try to make conversation. She appreciated that. She used the time to go over the medical scenarios in her head: penetrating trauma, blunt trauma, hypothermia, dehydration, infection, internal bleeding, the specific complications of injuries that had been managed without proper treatment for an extended period. She thought about what she had in the kit and what she'd need to improvise and what simply couldn't be addressed in the field. At 11:40, they stopped on a service track and went the rest of the way on foot. The compound's perimeter fence appeared out of the dark as a low shape, and Walsh found the gap with the calm efficiency of someone who had walked perimeters before. They went through in single file: Walsh, Farrow, 2 others whose names Claire had learned in the barn and was keeping ordered in her head. Then Claire, then the 6th team member, a man named Garrett, who coincidentally shared a first name with the person they were extracting, and whom the team called by his last name, Birch, specifically to avoid confusion. The Eastern Wing's exterior door was padlocked. Farrow had it open in 90 seconds. Inside was dark and smelled of concrete and stale air and something else, a medical smell, antiseptic and organic at the same time. She classified it automatically. Someone had used wound care products in this space recently, which meant either Lund had been given some level of medical attention or he had managed it himself. And the difference between those 2 possibilities mattered significantly. Walsh's flashlight found a corridor, a door, and behind the door a room with a bare light fixture and a cot and Garrett Lund. He was conscious. That was the first thing. Conscious and tracking them as they came through the door, which meant his neurological status was at least functional at the baseline level. The second thing was the wound. She could see it through the torn clothing, a penetrating injury to the right side of his chest, below the armpit, dressed with what appeared to be gauze that had been changed at least once, but not recently enough. The edges of the visible skin were wrong. The color, the texture. She was across the room before Walsh had finished her sweep of the corners. Lund, she said, kneeling beside the cot. I'm medical. Tell me where it hurts. He looked at her. His eyes were clear, but she could see the cost of maintaining that clarity, the specific concentration of someone who was working to stay functional. Ribs on the right, he said. His voice was rougher than she remembered it. Maybe 4 and 5, something wrong in there. When I breathe deep, it... He stopped. Don't breathe deep, she said, and her hands were already on him, moving through the assessment, airway, breathing, circulation, the quick organized inventory that told her what was happening and what she had minutes to address versus what would wait until they were out. He had a partial hemothorax. The blood accumulation on the right side had been slow enough that he'd been stable for most of the 11 days, compensating without fully understanding what he was compensating for. But the last 24 to 48 hours, by the signs she was reading, had pushed him past the point where the body could quietly manage it. He needed the pressure relieved. I'm going to do something that will feel significant, she said. I need you to hold very still. That's one way to describe it, Lund said. She looked at him for half a second, the same dry, tired, precise quality she remembered from the conference table 14 months ago. Hold still, she said again, and got to work. She was 90 seconds into the procedure when Walsh said, quietly, but with an edge that meant immediately, we have movement on the north side. And then, from somewhere outside and above, the compound's exterior lights came on. All of them. At once. Flooding the grounds with the kind of illumination that meant whoever had just activated them wasn't surprised. They'd been waiting. In the harsh light pouring through the room's narrow window, Lund looked at Claire with the expression of someone fitting pieces together and said, "There's someone in the hospital, in Silver Falls. Someone who knew I was here and told Bryce I was being looked for." His voice was strained but controlled. "Someone on the inside of Hargrove Regional has been feeding him information for months." She did not stop working. That was the thing. The lights came on, Walsh issued the warning, Lund said what he said about someone inside Hargrove Regional, and Claire's hands kept moving because the procedure was at a point where stopping was not a viable option. The needle was in. The pressure differential was being addressed. Stopping would undo the last 90 seconds and leave him worse than she'd found him. 30 more seconds, she said to nobody in particular, or to all of them, or to the room. Walsh didn't argue. She moved to the door with Farrow and took position in the corridor, weapon up, and the sound of boots on gravel outside told Claire the 30 seconds were going to be tight. 22 seconds later, she removed the needle, sealed the entry point, applied the occlusive dressing from the kit, and said, "Done. He needs support on the right side. He cannot run." "Understood," Walsh said, and Farrow was already at the cot, getting Lund upright with the practiced efficiency of someone who had extracted incapacitated personnel before and knew that the transition from horizontal to vertical was the moment most things went wrong. Lund hissed through his teeth when his feet hit the floor. His face went briefly white. He did not fall. "Can you walk?" Claire asked. "Working on it," he said. Work faster." She took his left side. Farrow took his right but held off from the injured ribs. They moved into the corridor and Walsh led them back the way they'd come, except faster now. The careful entry pace replaced by something that was not quite running but was not walking either. The specific compressed urgency of people trying to move quickly without creating sounds that would locate them precisely. The exterior lights meant cameras were likely active. Walsh had already accounted for this. She'd identified the camera positions in the planning phase and was routing them through a blind spot that existed between the southeast corner of the main building and the fence line. It was a narrower window than the northern entry, and it required them to cross 40 feet of open ground that was now illuminated. They stopped at the interior door. Walsh looked through a narrow gap, 30 feet from the fence. The camera on the main building's corner was panning left. "When it stops," Walsh said. 10 seconds. The camera stopped. They went. Claire was focused on keeping Lund moving, keeping his right side supported, keeping his airway clear, monitoring the quality of his breathing by the sound of it next to her ear because she couldn't assess him visually while they were in motion. His breathing was strained but rhythmic. The decompression had bought them time. How much time was a question she couldn't answer without equipment she didn't have. They made the fence. Birch was through first, holding the gap open. Walsh through next, taking position on the other side. Farrow and Lund. Then Claire, and the gap closed behind her as a shout went up from the northern side of the compound. Someone had found the room, found the empty cot, and the night was no longer quiet. They covered the distance to the service track in 4 minutes. It felt both like 4 minutes and like significantly longer. Lund stumbled twice, not from weakness but from the uneven ground. The dark. The particular disorientation of someone who had been in a single room for 11 days and was now moving fast through cold Wyoming night air, with his body doing its best to compensate for an injury it had been managing on incomplete resources. At the vehicles, Walsh made a decision that Claire would think about later. She put Claire and Lund in the second vehicle, with Birch driving, and told Farrow to ride in the first, splitting the team in a way that sacrificed some tactical coherence for medical practicality. Lund needed to be able to lie across the back seat. He needed Claire with him, and not with one eye on the threat behind them. "We're going straight to the secondary site," Walsh said through the window. "Do not take the main road." Birch nodded, and they moved. In the back of the vehicle, Claire got Lund repositioned, right side up, supported, his head elevated enough to ease the work his respiratory muscles were doing. She checked the dressing. Clean, no escalation of the bleeding she could detect manually. She took his pulse with her fingers on his wrist and counted. Fast, but not dangerous. His skin was cooler than she wanted, but not cold. "Talk to me," she said. "Keeps me informed and keeps you from going somewhere I can't follow." "What do you want me to say?" "Tell me about the inside contact." Everything you know. He was quiet for a moment. Not reluctant, she thought, but organizing. The way people do when they've been alone with information for a long time and suddenly have someone to give it to. I didn't know it was at the hospital specifically until about 4 days in, he said. His voice was steadier than she expected. Bryce was informed I was being looked for within hours of Vaught's team starting to move. That kind of speed means someone with direct access to medical or law enforcement networks in Silver Falls. Hargrove Regional is the only institution in that town that would have been in contact with anything connected to Vaught's operation. The fingerprint pull, Claire said. What? The hospital started a credentialing review on me. Part of that process was going to include pulling my fingerprints from the licensing file. She watched the dark road out the window. Vaught said the prints were how they found me in the first place. If someone at the hospital knew the review was happening, they'd know the prints would eventually go somewhere that would make the connection, Lund said, and they'd pass that information to Bryce. A pause. And Bryce would want to know who was coming for me before whoever was coming for me actually arrived. The vehicle moved through the dark. Birch was driving without headlights on the service track, using night vision equipment, and the ride was rough. The road was unpaved, and March had not been kind to the surface. Who initiated the credentialing review? Lund asked. Dr. Preston Holt, she said, Chief of Emergency Medicine. Who else was in the room? The nursing director, Renata Kowalski, and a credentialing consultant named Beverly Murch. Which of them would have had access to law enforcement networks, contacts outside the hospital? She thought about it honestly rather than immediately. Holt had been at Hargrove Regional for 11 years and had the kind of institutional connections that came with that tenure, on hospital boards, involved in regional medical associations, the sort of person who knew people across industries in a small state simply by virtue of being the kind of person who needed to know people. Kowalski had run nursing operations and had no obvious external connections she'd observed. Murch was a consultant outside the hospital's permanent structure, which meant external connections were inherent to her function. Murch or Holt, she said. You said Murch was a consultant, brought in specifically for this review? That's what Kowalski said. Lund absorbed this. Someone brought in a consultant specifically to run a credentialing review that would produce fingerprints. Someone who knew what those fingerprints would find. The road smoothed as they rejoined a paved surface, and Birch brought the headlights up. Through the rear window, no visible pursuit. Through the front, the first distant suggestion of Silver Falls light pollution against the sky. The secondary site was a property Vaught's team had established before the operation, a disused veterinary clinic on the south edge of a town called Burrell, 15 miles from Silver Falls. It had running water, electricity, and a room that had been converted into a field medical station, with the kind of supplies that a travel nurse on a 12-week contract absolutely did not have access to, which meant Vaught had planned for this contingency specifically. She spent an hour on Lund. It was not a clean hour. He was more compromised than the field assessment had indicated. Not dramatically, not in a way that required decisions she wasn't equipped to make, but in the way that injuries managed without proper care for 11 days always present more complications than the surface suggests. The hemothorax was the primary issue, and she'd addressed it, but there was a secondary problem with the wound margins that suggested the beginning of infection, and his core temperature was low enough that warming was a priority. She had to balance against the movement restriction his injury required. She did not have everything she needed. She made decisions about what she had, worked methodically through the priorities, and did not catastrophize about the gaps. Catastrophizing was a version of distraction, and distraction had consequences. Lund bore it with the specific stoicism of someone who had made the decision before the procedure started to not make the experience worse by reacting to it. He flinched twice, once when she addressed the wound margins, once when she repositioned him for temperature management. Both times he made a sound that was controlled and brief and said nothing after it. Walsh appeared in the doorway midway through. Claire told her he needed hospital-level care within 6 hours, ideally 4. Walsh nodded and left to make calls. When the immediate work was done, Claire sat back on her heels and let herself feel, for approximately 45 seconds, the specific weight of having done the thing well enough. Not perfectly, she'd noted every compromise and deviation from optimal practice, but well enough that Garrett Lund was going to survive this night and possibly the next several, and that was what well enough meant. He was watching her. His eyes were clearer than when they'd found him. "You were in Draven Protocol," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. I read the file before I went in." He paused. "Your name wasn't in the casualty section. It was in the unaccounted section. There's a difference." "I know there is." He held her gaze. "I went in because of Kessler, and what he did, and what happened to the 3 people who died because of it. I went in because I knew the official investigation was wrong." Another pause. "I went in because someone who survived that operation should have had answers and didn't." She looked at the supply case she'd been working from, organized it with hands that were not quite steady now, with the particular tremor that showed up after sustained high-intensity work, not the anxiety tremor Holt had cataloged and used against her, but the ordinary physiological response of a nervous system that had been running at elevated output for too long. "What did you find?" she asked. "Enough." He said it with the flat certainty of someone who had paid a significant price for the information and wanted her to understand the price had been worth it. Financial records. Callum Bryce received a wire transfer 48 hours before the Draven Protocol operation. Offshore account routed through 2 shells, but the originating account connects to a defense contractor that was competing for a contract the operation was designed to support. The contractor would have lost the contract if the operation succeeded. He stopped to manage his breathing. A deliberate pause, controlled. Bryce sold the coordinate because someone paid him to ensure the operation failed. The 3 operators died because a contractor didn't want to lose a bid. The room was quiet, except for the equipment humming and the sound of the wind outside, which had picked up since midnight, the way Wyoming winds do in March when a front moves through. She'd spent 22 months in a version of this story where the explanation for what happened was some combination of operational failure and bad luck. She'd run the scenarios, identified the variables, and arrived repeatedly at the conclusion that the only explanation that fit the evidence was deliberate betrayal, and then she'd filed that conclusion away because she had no proof and no standing and no identity that could be used to demand either. Now Garrett Lund had the proof. The proof existed. It was documented. And it was currently housed in a server cache he'd established before going into the compound, in a location he'd given to a contact before going dark, designed to be retrieved exactly when he came out. "Where's the contact?" she asked. "Billings. She'll release the cache to Vought as soon as I call her." "Call her now." He looked at her for a moment, then said, "Get me a phone." Vought arrived at the Burrell Clinic at 2 in the morning with Farrow and 2 additional people Claire hadn't met, one of whom turned out to be a physician. An actual physician with a field trauma kit that made her field supplies look like a first aid course handout. She stepped back and let him work, gave him a full verbal handoff, and stood in the corridor outside while the assessment happened. Walsh found her there. "The cache is being retrieved," Walsh said. "Vaught's people have it. It's substantial." A pause. "Enough to support federal prosecution." "And Bryce?" "The compound is under surveillance. We have federal authorization to move on him within the next 24 hours. His own security personnel are going to be a complication, but—" Walsh stopped, started again. "It's manageable." "What about the inside contact at Hargrove?" Walsh's expression changed, something tightening around the eyes. "Vaught's people ran a contact analysis based on what Lund described. The timing of Bryce's awareness of the search for Lund, the specific information he had access to." She paused. "The credentialing review was initiated by Holt, but the external connection is Beverly Murch." Claire looked at the wall. "She's a consultant who has worked with Bryce's firm," Walsh said. "Financial records put her on a retainer that started 14 months ago. She's been embedded in regional hospital systems as a credentialing consultant. It's a legitimate practice on the surface, gives her access to sensitive personnel files and institutional contacts across the region. She was placed in the review specifically to access my fingerprints," Claire said. "We think so, and to accelerate the timeline so Bryce knew exactly what was coming and when." She thought about sitting in that conference room, Holt's carefully constructed indignation, Murch's calibrated neutral tone, the whole performance of an institutional procedure that had been, at least in part, an intelligence operation. She'd sat across from them and known something was wrong and hadn't known exactly what, and now she did. "Is she still in Silver Falls?" "As far as we know." "And Holt?" We don't believe Holt knew what merch was. He may have been used. Walsh looked at her steadily. That's a determination for the federal investigators, not for us. The physician came out of the room behind them and told Vaught, who had appeared in the corridor, that Lund needed a surgical facility within 4 hours. Not negotiable. The hemothorax had been managed, but the infection required intervention that couldn't be completed in the field. Vaught confirmed transport was already arranged, and then looked at Claire. You should be there, he said. Lund specifically asked. She looked at him. I'm not a surgeon. He knows that. Vaught's voice was dry. He asked for you, not for a surgeon. She rode in the transport vehicles, not an ambulance, an unmarked SUV with medical equipment in the back. Military grade, the kind of thing that existed in the gap between official and unofficial operations. She sat beside Lund in the dark and monitored his vitals while the Wyoming landscape moved past outside at 80 miles an hour. There's something else, Lund said at one point. His voice was quieter. The energy that had carried him through the clinic was thinning. About Bryce. He's not going to wait for federal investigators to move. Walsh said 24 hours. He knows the cache exists. He knew Lund had documentation before He stopped, corrected himself. He knew I had documentation. He knew it the moment his people found the empty room. A breath. He's going to move to neutralize whatever he can't recover. That means the cache, it means Vaught's operation, and it means anyone who can testify to what the documentation contains. She understood what he was saying before he finished saying it. He'll come for you, she said. He'll come for both of us. Lund looked at her. You were dead. Now you're not. And you were there for Draven Protocol. You're a witness to the operational circumstances, regardless of documentation. She processed this, ran the logic through. He'd come to the hospital, she said. If he's trying to neutralize witnesses quickly, he goes where the witnesses are. And right now, Vaught's people have the compound under surveillance, which means Bryce already knows the operation is moving against him. He's not going to sit in the compound and wait. No, Lund said. He's not. She thought about Hargrove Regional Medical Center at 3:30 in the morning. Night staff. Reduced security. The particular vulnerability of a building full of people who were focused entirely on the patients in front of them, and not on the possibility that someone was about to walk through their doors for a reason that had nothing to do with medicine. She thought about Bridget Tully at the charge desk, about Renata Kowalski, who had warned her about the fingerprints with the quiet solidarity of one professional woman to another, about the residents, the younger nurses, the overnight staff who were in that building because it was their shift, and they had no reason to believe the night would be anything other than a night. Tell Vaught, she said to Lund. Already did, he said. The moment I called my contact in Billings, I sent a message to Vaught about Bryce's likely next move. And? He's redirecting 2 federal vehicles to Hargrove Regional. A pause. ETA is 40 minutes. She looked out the window. The transport vehicle was moving fast. Silver Falls was somewhere ahead of them in the dark, its light pollution making a low orange smear against the clouds. 40 minutes. She calculated what 40 minutes meant in a building where the security desk ran one person overnight and the entry points were not monitored for individuals who looked like they belonged. Then her phone buzzed. Bridget Tully's name on the screen, the charge nurse's direct number, which she'd given Claire in week 3 for patient coordination and which Claire had not yet had reason to use. She answered. Tully's voice was controlled but compressed in the way voices get when someone is actively choosing not to alarm the people around them. There's a man at the secondary entrance, she said. He told the security desk he's a federal consultant with ID credentials. He's asking for access to restricted patient records. A breath. But he asked specifically for records associated with the travel nurse. By name, your name, and the security guard has no reason not to let him in. Claire looked at the dark road ahead and the distant glow of Silver Falls against the sky. Tully, she said, lock down the secondary entrance, right now. Tell the security guard there's a credentialing dispute and no external access is permitted without administrator approval. Do not say why. I can't. You absolutely can. You're the charge nurse. This is your department. Lock it down and don't let him inside until you hear from me. A silence. Then Tully said, all right. The call ended. Claire looked at the driver. How fast can you get to Hargrove Regional? The driver looked at her in the mirror. Then it Vaught's people in the front passenger seat. Faster than this, the front passenger said, and reached for something on the dashboard. The vehicle accelerated. Somewhere behind them, Garrett Lund shifted against his restraints and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. And somewhere ahead, in a building full of people who had no idea what was about to walk through their door, a man who had sold 3 soldiers' lives for a contractor's fee was presenting federal credentials to a night security guard who had absolutely no reason to doubt them. The transport hit 100 miles an hour on the empty road, and the darkness came apart around them, and Claire's hands on her knees were completely, absolutely still. The vehicle hit the Hargrove Regional parking lot at 4:11 in the morning, and Claire was out before it stopped moving. Not running, not yet. Moving with the specific compressed speed of someone who understands that running draws attention in a hospital environment, and attention right now was a resource to be managed carefully. She'd been inside this building for 12 weeks. She knew the secondary entrance, knew the corridor layout behind it, knew exactly how many steps from the door to the trauma corridor, and exactly which sections of that path had sightlines from the nurses' station. The secondary entrance was locked. Tully had done what she'd been asked to do. The security panel beside the door showed a red indicator light. Claire badged in with her hospital ID, which still worked because nobody had formally terminated her contract in the last 12 hours, despite everything else that had happened, and she was inside before the door had fully swung open. The corridor beyond was dim. Overnight lighting, half the fixtures running, the kind of institutional twilight that hospital night shifts exist inside. She moved toward the trauma wing and registered, in the first 20 steps, that something was wrong with the quality of the silence. Night shifts in emergency departments are never fully quiet. Monitors, distant voices, the occasional overhead page. But this silence had a different texture, more compressed, more deliberate. She stopped at the junction of the main trauma corridor. Tully was at the nurses' station with 2 overnight nurses and a resident, Marcus Whelan, of all people, who apparently pulled overnight rotations in addition to his regular schedule. They were positioned in a way that wasn't quite normal, together but facing outward, the way people position themselves when they're trying to appear calm while monitoring something. Tully looked at her and then, very slightly, looked left. Claire looked left. The man was at the far end of the trauma corridor, 40 feet away, standing in the space between Bay 3 and the supply alcove. He was in his mid-50s, heavy-built, wearing a jacket that was slightly too formal for the middle of the night, and holding a set of credentials that he'd apparently been using to navigate past the locked secondary entrance via a second approach she hadn't accounted for. He was looking at a tablet. He hadn't seen her yet. This was not Callum Bryce. She registered that immediately. Bryce was mid-50s, but she'd seen his file photos, leaner, different face structure. This was someone else. Someone Bryce had sent ahead or was working with, or had positioned here before the night's events fully escalated. He looked up from the tablet and saw her. For 2 seconds, neither of them moved. Then he reached into his jacket. She was already moving, not toward him, which was what he'd expect, but sideways into the nearest bay, using the partition wall as cover. The motion was automatic in the way things become automatic after sufficient repetition, the body cataloging the geometry of the space and acting on it before the conscious mind has finished issuing the instruction. Behind her, she heard Tully's voice, sharp, controlled, directing the overnight staff toward the back corridor with the kind of authority that doesn't invite questions. Good, get them out. The man in the corridor was moving towards the bay entrance. She needed to not be where he expected her to be. She moved to the far side of the bay, behind the equipment cluster, crash cart, monitor stand, IV pole, and took a breath that was slower than her heart rate warranted. He came through the bay entrance with the tablet in one hand and something else in the other that she didn't want to look at directly yet. He swept left first, where he'd last seen her, and she was already moving from the right, toward the door, putting herself between him and the corridor exit. Stop, she said. He turned. I don't know who you are, she said, and I don't need to. I need you to put that down and step back against the wall. You're the nurse, he said. The way he said it, with a specific flatness, like confirming a data point, told her that he'd been briefed, that he knew exactly who she was or who she had been, and that the word nurse was not what he was thinking when he said it. Step back, she said again. He didn't step back. He took stock of the room in a way that professionals do. Fast, thorough, looking for variables. He found them. She was not armed. She was between him and the corridor exit, but not between him and the bay's secondary access, which connected to a service hallway. He moved for the secondary access. She moved faster and cut him off. It was not elegant. She knocked into the IV pole, and it went over with a sound that was loud in the quiet corridor, metal hitting linoleum, and the impact disrupted his path enough that she got position on his right side and got both hands on the arm holding the weapon. What happened next was not clean. She'd been trained in combatives, had spent enough time in operational environments that the training had been refreshed regularly. But 22 months was 22 months, and he was larger than her and not incapacitated. And the word she would later use to describe the 30 seconds that followed was managed, as in she managed to keep the weapon from being oriented in a useful direction for him, while also managing to not be in a position where he could simply overpower her with mass. He slammed her into the supply alcove shelving. She felt the edge of a shelf in her lower back, and it was going to leave something significant. She kept her hands on his arm. I was trying to break her grip by rotating, which would have worked, except that she let the rotation happen and redirected it, using his own movement to push him off balance toward the bay entrance. He stumbled. Not far. Not enough. Then the trauma corridor lights came on. All of them. Full brightness. The overnight half-power giving way to the full clinical illumination that meant someone had hit the emergency activation panel. And from the main entrance, 40 feet in the opposite direction, came the sound of multiple people moving fast. Commander Vaught's 2 federal vehicles had arrived. Not in 40 minutes. In 26, because someone in that convoy had made decisions about speed limits that the state of Wyoming had not authorized. 4 federal agents came through the main trauma corridor entrance. They identified the situation in approximately 4 seconds. Man with a weapon, woman without one, close quarters, clear context. And 2 of them covered the man in the bay, while the other 2 secured the corridor exits. He lowered the weapon. He did not do it quickly or graciously. He did it because the arithmetic had shifted, and he was the kind of person who could read arithmetic. Claire stepped back from him. Her hands were shaking. Not the quiet tremor of long shifts or elevated output, but the specific full-body tremor of adrenaline that has nowhere left to go. She pressed them against her thighs and breathed through it. One of the federal agents, a woman in her 30s, dark jacket, the calm of someone who had done this specific kind of work before, looked at Claire. "You all right?" "Yes," Claire said, which was approximately true. "Is the building secure otherwise?" "I don't know. There may be a second individual, a woman named Beverly Murch. She was in the building yesterday. I don't know if she's here now." The agent spoke into a radio. The other agents spread through the corridor. Tully appeared at the nurses' station entrance, having apparently not evacuated to the back corridor as instructed, but instead taken a position of observation behind the station partition, which was exactly what Claire would have expected from her. "That man," Tully said, looking at the individual now being restrained by 2 federal agents, has been showing ID claiming to be a federal health compliance officer since approximately 3:40 this morning. "He's not," Claire said. "I gathered." Tully's voice was dry. "He asked to access 3 patient files. I told him patient privacy law required administrator sign-off, which I knew he knew was a delay tactic, and he knew I knew he knew, and we spent about 20 minutes in that mutual understanding." A pause. "I was hoping you'd arrive before it deteriorated further." "Did it deteriorate before I arrived?" "Somewhat." Whelan was at Tully's side. He'd been there since Claire entered, She'd registered him earlier and now registered more specifically the expression he was wearing, which was the expression of someone who had been in a building with a potentially dangerous intruder for the last 30 minutes and was processing how close that had actually been. "There's a patient in Bay 7, he said. "She came in at 2 o'clock. Fall injury, overnight observation. She's been asking what's going on." "Tell her it's a security drill," Tully said. "Be convincing." Whelan went. Beverly Murch was located 40 minutes later, not in Hargrove Regional, but in her car in the parking lot of a laundromat 6 blocks away, with her phone in her hand and a bag in the back seat that suggested she'd been planning to be elsewhere by morning. A federal agent who had been monitoring her registered vehicle had followed her from the motel where she'd been staying and intercepted her before she reached the highway. She did not go quietly in the rhetorical sense. She was physically cooperative. She knew what resisting looked like, and she was too careful for that. But she talked, and what she said was calibrated to be maximally unhelpful while appearing to cooperate. She said she was a legitimate consultant. She said she'd been retained by the hospital through standard channels. She said she had no knowledge of Callum Bryce beyond a professional acquaintance. The agent told her what they had: the financial records, the retainer documentation, the timeline of information flows. And Murch went quiet. Vaught arrived at Hargrove Regional at 4:50. He came through the main entrance with Farrow and the female agent who'd spoken to Claire in the trauma corridor, and he moved through the building with the unhurried authority of someone who had been operating in complicated situations for long enough that complicated no longer required additional energy. He found Claire in the break room. She was sitting at the small table with a cup of the overnight coffee that had been burning since midnight and was making no claims to be drinkable. She was drinking it anyway. He sat down across from her without preamble. "Lund is in surgery," he said. "He'll be out within 2 hours. The prognosis is good." She nodded. "The cash is fully retrieved and documented. It's with federal investigators. The wire transfer records, the communication logs, the financial connection between Bryce and the contracting entity." He folded his hands on the table. "It's enough." "For prosecution?" "For several prosecutions." He paused. "Bryce is in custody. The compound operation moved at 4 o'clock. He was on site. He hadn't left. We think he was waiting for confirmation from the individual you encountered in the trauma corridor before deciding whether to run or manage the situation from a position of deniability." A pause. "He waited too long." She looked at the coffee cup. "Murch is in custody," Vaught continued. "Her cooperation is likely. She has significant exposure and limited loyalty. That's a useful combination for investigators." "And Holt?" He was quiet for a moment. "Holt doesn't appear to have known what Murch was. He initiated the credentialing review independently. It was a genuine institutional concern from his perspective, not an action taken with knowledge of her role." Another pause. "That doesn't make his behavior over the last 12 weeks better. It makes it differently bad." She thought about that, about the distinction between weaponized and merely careless, and whether the distinction mattered to the person absorbing the impact. She thought about 12 weeks of being called a rotating body, of having her competence questioned in public spaces, of being assigned to triage support during a mass casualty event by a man who had decided what she was before she'd done anything to earn the assessment. "What happens to the Draven protocol record?" she asked. "That's a formal process," Vaught said. "It takes time, but the documentation Lund retrieved, combined with your testimony and the financial evidence, the official record will be corrected. The 3 operators who died will have their deaths reclassified. Their families will be informed of the actual circumstances." She looked at the wall. "And your record," he said, "your service record, your rank. That's also a formal process, but it moves. It will move." "I'm not the same person who left," she said. "No," he said. "You're not. That's not the same as saying your record should reflect that you're dead." She didn't have an answer to that. She sat with it. "There's going to be a conversation," Vaught said, "about what comes next for you. Not tonight, not this week. But it's a conversation that needs to happen, and I want you to know it's one you have standing in. You have options, real ones." She thought about 12 weeks in this building, about a room 114 motel with a window facing the parking lot, about sitting in a meeting and looking at Preston Holt across a table and knowing that the gap between what he saw and what was actually there was the exact size of everything she'd been carrying since the extraction point where 3 people didn't make it out. "Right now," she said, "I need to finish something here." Well, at 7:15 in the morning, Hargrove Regional's administrator, a man named Gerald Purcell, who had been called in by Renata Kowalski at 4:30 and had been dealing with federal agents and incident reports for the last 2 hours and 45 minutes, convened an emergency meeting in the main conference room. It was attended by Kowalski, Holt, the department heads who had been reachable on short notice, and several individuals who were not hospital staff and whose presence in the room told every person there that this was not an internal matter. Claire arrived late, not by accident. She wanted Holt to have had time to receive enough information that he understood, going in, what the shape of the conversation was. She sat at the end of the table opposite Purcell, and Vaught sat beside her, and for a moment the room was very quiet. Purcell outlined the events of the night with the careful, slightly nauseated tone of an administrator. who has realized that something significant occurred inside his institution while he was asleep. He was accurate, if incomplete. When he finished, he looked at the federal representatives, and one of them, the female agent, whose name Claire had learned was Special Agent Donna Ferris, gave a more complete account. Murch's role. The information pipeline to Bryce. The credentialing review as a mechanism for accessing Claire's identity documentation. The specific sequence of events from the previous evening through the early hours of the morning. Holt sat at the table with an expression that changed several times during Ferris's account. He started with the controlled professional blankness of someone managing their reaction carefully, but by the time Ferris reached the description of Murch's retainer arrangement and its timeline, which began 14 months ago, well before Claire's contract, which meant Murch had been embedded in the regional hospital system in advance of Claire's arrival and had likely been part of the mechanism that directed Holt's attention toward a credentialing review. The blankness had become something less controlled. He looked at Claire. She looked back at him. He looked away first. Dr. Holt, Ferris said, initiated the credentialing review independently. There is no current evidence that he had knowledge of Murch's true role or her connection to the Bryce organization. She said it factually, without absolution, which was the right register. Holt said nothing. Purcell said, "Ms. Merritt," and then stopped, because Vaught had put a folder on the table and slid it toward the center of the room, and Purcell was reading the cover page. "The individual who has been employed here as Claire Merritt," Vaught said, "is Senior Chief Andrea Reeves, United States Navy, retired. Her service record, which was incorrectly annotated as killed in action 22 months ago, is being formally corrected. Her identity documentation under the name Merritt was established for reasons that relate to an ongoing federal investigation, the details of which are covered under classification. I won't be getting into today. The room processed this. What I will say," Vaught continued, "is that Senior Chief Reeves holds advanced combat medical certifications that significantly exceed the documented training in the file you've been reviewing. The skill set you have observed in this department over the last 12 weeks is consistent with her service record." He paused. "The credentialing gap that prompted your review was a function of circumstances that are now part of the federal case. It was not a function of incompetence or fraud." Holt was looking at the folder. Kowalski was looking at Claire. There was something in her expression, not surprise exactly, more like the specific look of someone who had suspected something and is now watching the shape of their suspicion become a fact. "The question of how this department responds to the events of the last 12 hours, Purcell said carefully, is one that Hargrove Regional will need to address through its own processes." "Yes," Vaught agreed. "It is." He left the implication where it was. He didn't need to do more than that. The people in the room were smart enough to understand what was being communicated without being told directly, and smart enough to know that what Claire had demonstrated in this building over 12 weeks, and what she had done in the last 12 hours, was not a thing that could be explained away or filed under a bureaucratic category. The meeting ended without conclusions, because formal conclusions weren't available yet, and Purcell was too careful a man to make them without full information. People filed out. Vaught touched Claire's shoulder briefly and went to speak with Ferris. Holt was the last to leave the table. He stood slowly and gathered the papers in front of him, a habitual gesture, something to do with the hands. And when he finally looked at Claire, his expression was not what she'd been expecting. She'd expected defensiveness. She'd expected the particular self-protective rationalization that people use when the evidence that they've been wrong is comprehensive and public. She'd seen it before, in other buildings, from other people who had made confident assessments that turned out to be significantly incorrect. Instead, he looked tired, and something else that took her a moment to name. Specifically ashamed, not performatively, not as a posture calculated to manage the moment, but in the way people look when they've understood something about their own behavior that they can't easily dismiss. "The tourniquet," he said, "in the ambulance bay during the bridge collapse. I heard about it afterward." She looked at him. "And Bay 4, he said. "I looked at the chart. The decision you made about the amiodarone versus immediate cardio version. I've been thinking about it since yesterday." He paused. "You were right. If Whelan had defibrillated at that rhythm, we'd have lost him." She said nothing. "I was wrong about you," he said. "It came out flat and unpolished. without the rhetorical scaffolding that usually surrounds admissions of this kind. I decided what you were in the first week, and I used everything after that to confirm it. He stopped. That's not how I'm supposed to practice, and it's not how I'm supposed to lead, and I did it anyway. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 12 weeks, about triage support during a mass casualty event, about rotating bodies. I'm not going to tell you it was fine, she said. It wasn't. He nodded. I know. But I'll tell you this. She held his gaze. The next travel nurse who comes through that door, don't make the same assessment on the first week. They might be nobody. They might be someone who surprises you. Either way, they deserve to find out on the job rather than having the verdict read to them on day 3. He looked at her for a moment longer than the exchange warranted. I'll remember that, he said. She didn't know whether that was true. She thought it might be, and that was enough to work with. At 10 in the morning, she was in the room where Garrett Lund had been taken after his surgery. A private room, standard equipment, nothing military about it except the 2 individuals stationed in the corridor outside who were not hospital staff. He was awake. He looked terrible in the comprehensive way of someone who has recently been through surgery after 11 days of captivity, which was accurate and unavoidable and did not concern her because the chart on the door told her the surgery had gone as well as it could have and his vitals were stable. She sat in the chair beside the bed. You look rough, she said. You look like you slept in a vehicle, he said. I did sleep in a vehicle. That tracks. He shifted slightly, managed the discomfort, settled. Vought briefed me. Bryce is in custody. Murch is cooperating. I know. The cash is with federal investigators. I know that too. A silence. Not uncomfortable. The kind that exists between people who have recently been through something significant together and are both still processing the specific texture of what significant actually means in this instance. The 3 operators, he said. Draven protocol. Their families are going to be told. Vought said so. I went in because of them, he said. I want you to know that. I knew you were out there somewhere. I'd been tracking that line of inquiry for 8 months before I found the nursing license. But the primary reason was them. What happened to them? What was done to them? She looked at the window. Morning light, Wyoming in March, the particular pale quality of a sky that hasn't decided yet whether it wants to produce weather. I know, she said. You were the one I needed to find, he said quieter. To tell that it wasn't. That what happened at the extraction point wasn't a failure of the operation or a failure of the team. It was a betrayal. By someone who was supposed to be on the same side. He paused. You knew that. I think you knew it. But I wanted you to have something to show for knowing it. She didn't answer immediately. The chair was slightly too low for the height of the bed, which was a hospital design issue that existed in approximately every hospital she'd ever been in. You went into a hostile compound alone for 11 days for a set of financial records, she said. They were very comprehensive financial records. You almost died in there. I knew the risk. That's not the same as the risk being reasonable. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression that she chose not to name yet. Not because she didn't recognize it, but because this was a hospital room at 10 in the morning, and he had recently had surgery, and there was a time for some things, and this was not it. Senior Chief Reeves, he said. Don't, she said. It's your name. It's part of my name, she said. I've been someone else for 22 months. Both things are going to be true for a while. He accepted that. Outside in the corridor, one of the federal agent's radios produced a brief burst of sound. A voice, a response, then quiet again. The ordinary sound of an institution continuing to function, patients being admitted, staff changes, the specific background texture of a building that exists to address whatever today brings without knowing in advance what today will bring. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A number she didn't recognize. Not a Wyoming area code, Federal Exchange, the kind of prefix she knew from a different version of her life. She stood up and moved to the window to answer it. Reeves. The voice on the other end was someone she didn't know, speaking with the careful formality of official communications. This is the office of the Deputy Director, Naval Special Operations Command. We've been briefed on the situation in Wyoming and on the status of your service record. I'm calling to inform you that the formal correction process has been initiated. Your death notation will be removed. Your rank will be restored. Your decorations, including the ones from the Draven Protocol operation, will be reinstated. A pause. There is also a commendation being prepared for actions associated with last night's events. She looked at the parking lot below the window, the morning light on the vehicles, a nurse walking across the lot carrying a coffee cup, moving fast, running slightly late, just another Tuesday. "I'll need some time," she said. "That's understood." Another pause. "There is no pressure regarding future service, but I want you to know that the door is not closed." The call ended. She stood at the window for a moment. Behind her, Lund's monitor was generating its steady rhythm, the specific sound of a heart that has been through something significant and is still, despite everything, continuing. She turned back to the room. Lund was watching her. "What was that?" he asked. "Official business," she said, and sat back down. She was still there when Renata Kowalski knocked on the door frame 40 minutes later, came in with the particular careful body language of someone entering a space where the normal institutional rules have been temporarily suspended, and placed a folded document on the bedside table beside Claire's chair. "Holt signed it this morning," Kowalski said. "It's a formal commendation for your conduct during the bridge collapse response." She paused. "He was awkward about it. He asked me to deliver it rather than bring it himself." "That tracks," Claire said. "He also," Kowalski started. Stopped. "He asked me to tell you that he's requested an independent review of the department's treatment of contract and travel staff. He said it was overdue." Claire looked at the document on the table. "That's a start," she said. Kowalski nodded and turned to leave, then stopped in the doorway. She looked at the room, at Lund in the bed, at Claire in the chair beside it, at the specific quality of the space between them, which even someone without context could read. "The credentialing review is closed," Kowalski said, "for what it's worth." "I know," Claire said. After Kowalski left, Lund said, "What happens now?" She thought about the question, about Vought's conversation at 3 in the morning, about the call from the deputy director's office, about a room 114 motel with her truck parked outside it, and a contract with 3 weeks left to run. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's honest." "It's the most honest thing I've said in 22 months. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have an apartment in Billings. I've been using it as a base while I was working the Bryce investigation. I wasn't planning on continuing to use it for that purpose, obviously." A pause. "It has a second bedroom, in case the 12-week contract situation resolves in a direction that leaves you without immediate plans." She looked at him. "I'm not suggesting anything," he said, clearly suggesting something. "I'm just noting that a person who has recently had their documented existence corrected might want a stable base of operations while they figure out what comes next, practically speaking." She was quiet for long enough that he started to look like he was regretting it. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded, looked at the ceiling, looked back at her. Outside the hospital, in the Hargrove Regional parking lot, 2 federal vehicles were still positioned near the main entrance. Inside the building, staff were beginning the morning routine. Shift change, rounds, the ordinary infrastructure of a place that does the same essential work every day, regardless of what happened the night before. And at the far end of the 3rd-floor corridor, in a room that had just been vacated, the cleaning staff found a tablet under the mattress of the bed where Beverly Murch had been sitting during her brief detention before federal transport. The tablet was password-protected and locked. A federal agent logged it into evidence and placed it in a sealed bag. The agent wrote the item number on the log, reached for the next item, then stopped, because something on the face of the tablet's locked screen was visible through the evidence bag. A notification arrived after the lock, showing a partial preview of a message that had come in 3 minutes ago. The agent photographed the screen through the bag. The message preview showed 11 words. "Package is secure." 3rd location. "Proceed when ready." He doesn't know. The agent read it twice, then reached for her radio. The agent's radio call went up the chain in under 3 minutes. By the time it reached Vought, he was in the parking lot preparing to leave for the federal processing facility where Bryce was being held, and the call stopped him with one hand on the vehicle door. He listened. He asked 2 questions. He walked back inside. He found Claire in Lund's room where he'd left her, which was efficient. He also found this development inconvenient to explain in a way that didn't immediately escalate everything she'd been through in the last 8 hours. But inconvenient or not, she needed to know. He showed her the photograph of the tablet screen through the evidence bag. She read the 11 words twice, the same way the agent had. Package is secure. Third location. Proceed when ready. He doesn't know. He doesn't know, she said. Bryce is in custody. The message is telling someone that Bryce's arrest hasn't changed something. That there's a component of this operation that Bryce himself didn't have full visibility into. She looked at Vaught. What was Murch's role beyond the hospital access? We assumed intelligence conduit, Vaught said. Someone who fed Bryce information about regional personnel and operations. You assumed? She handed the photograph back. If she was running a parallel operation, something Bryce funded but didn't control, the arrest of Bryce doesn't close it. It just removes the person at the top of the visible structure. Lund had been listening from the bed with the particular stillness of someone conserving energy while remaining fully engaged. The financial records, he said. The cash I pulled from the compound. There were transactions I flagged as secondary. Smaller amounts, different routing, didn't fit the pattern of the main Bryce-to-contractor pipeline. I noted them, but didn't analyze them fully because the primary documentation was the priority. Where are those records now? In the cache with federal investigators. Vaught was already on his phone. He stepped into the corridor. Claire could hear the conversation in fragments. Clipped, technical. The specific shorthand of people who communicate in conditions where full sentences are a luxury. She looked at Lund. How detailed were the secondary transactions? She asked. Detailed enough that someone structured them intentionally to be overlooked. Small enough to miss on a first pass, large enough to matter if you were looking for them. He paused. They went to a shell entity I couldn't identify in the field. 2 letters and a number, NDR 7. She filed that. Vaught came back in. The forensic team is pulling the secondary transactions now. It's going to take time. He looked at Claire. In the meantime, the message on Murch's tablet came from a number associated with a prepaid device purchased in Casper 6 weeks ago. Triangulation puts it currently active in Silver Falls. Someone local, she said. Someone who knew Murch's arrest was coming, knew Bryce was in custody, and sent that message anyway. Which means they believe whatever they're protecting is secure enough that the Bryce operation going down doesn't touch it. She thought about this. About a 14-month operation, carefully constructed with Beverly Murch as the visible layer and someone else as the foundation. About the specific confidence of a message sent after a colleague's arrest. About NDR 7 and secondary transactions that had been structured to be overlooked. Who at Hargrove Regional has been here longest, she said. Vaught and Lund both looked at her. Murch came in as a consultant 14 months ago, she said. She needed an entry point. Someone who could smooth her access to institutional networks, who had existing relationships with regional contacts, who wouldn't ask questions because they believed they were doing routine administrative work. She stopped. Or who asked the right questions and got paid not to keep asking. You're looking for whoever brought Murch in, Vaught said. I'm looking for whoever NDR 7 is. It took the forensic team 4 hours. During those 4 hours, Claire went back to the motel, slept for 90 minutes in the actual bed rather than a vehicle, showered, changed into the last clean clothes she had in the room, and returned to the hospital at 2 in the afternoon. She wasn't needed anywhere specifically. She went because the hospital was where the answer was going to arrive, and she'd rather be present when it did. She spent the time in the break room doing something that looked like nothing, sitting with bad coffee and a 3-week-old magazine she wasn't reading, and was actually an informal inventory of everything she'd observed in 12 weeks inside Hargrove Regional that she hadn't assigned significance to at the time. Beverly Murch had been introduced to the credentialing system by someone. That introduction would have required a letter of recommendation or a direct referral from someone with standing at the hospital. The administrator, Purcell, was too careful and too institutional to have done it without documentation. Holt had initiated the review that used Murch, but Holt was reactive. He hadn't brought Murch in, he'd used her when she was available, which meant someone else had established Murch's access before Holt ever reached for the phone. She thought about 12 weeks of faces, nursing staff, residents, administrators, the various peripheral personnel who moved through a hospital's operational layer without drawing specific attention. She thought about who had access to patient records, personnel files, and external contractor relationships simultaneously. She thought about the supply room she'd memorized in week 2, and the person she'd seen in that supply room 3 times. Not a nurse, not a physician, not maintenance, but someone who appeared at intervals with the casual comfort of long familiarity and who she'd categorized at the time as administrative support. A man in his late 40s who wore the specific lanyard of Hargrove Regional's Operational Management Division and who had never spoken to her directly because people in operational management didn't speak directly to travel nurses. She went to find Renata Kowalski. Kowalski was in her office, the door open, which was unusual for 2 in the afternoon on a day this complicated, and which Claire read as a deliberate signal. Kowalski looked up when Claire appeared in the doorway. "I need you to tell me who manages external contractor relationships in operational management," Claire said. Kowalski was quiet for a moment. Something moved through her expression. Not surprise again. That same quality of a suspicion clarifying. "Why?" Kowalski said. "Because I think merch was brought in through that channel, and I think whoever managed that introduction is the third point of the structure Vaught's people are looking for." Kowalski looked at her desk. "Operational management contractor relationships go through the Deputy Operations Director." She paused. "His name is Warren Teal. He's been at this hospital for 9 years. The man with the lanyard. "Where is he now?" Claire asked. "He called in sick this morning," Kowalski said. "First sick day in 14 months. Vaught had Warren Teal's address from the employee records within 20 minutes. He was at the residence, a house on the eastern edge of Silver Falls, with 2 federal agents at 3:15 in the afternoon, and Claire was not with them because she was not a federal agent, and Vaught had been clear that the days of her operating in a field context for this particular situation were finished. She accepted this. She went back to the break room. At 4:40, Vaught called. "Teal is in custody," he said. The house had a secondary communications setup, encrypted, dedicated hardware, the kind of thing that doesn't exist in the home of a hospital operations director without a specific reason. A pause. "The NDR-7 entity is a shell corporation. He's been running for 8 years. It predates merch, predates Bryce's involvement with the hospital. Teal has been selling access to regional institutional networks for nearly a decade. Medical records, personnel data, contractor information. Bryce was one of several clients." "What's in the package?" she said. The message said package is secure. Third location. "A server," Vaught said. "Physical server, stored at a property Teal owns under a family member's name 40 miles east. It contains 8 years of data accessed through Hargrove Regional's institutional systems, patient records, personnel files, law enforcement interface logs, contractor documents." Another pause. "Including the original query that flagged your fingerprints. He didn't just access it, he copied it and sold it to Bryce directly. Bryce knew about you before Vaught's office processed the state board referral." She sat with that. "He was ahead of us," she said, "for about 72 hours. Then Lund's operation started closing the gap." A pause. "Teal didn't know about Lund until Merch flagged it. By then, the extraction was already in motion." 8 years, she said. 8 years. "The data volume is significant. Federal investigators are treating it as a major breach. The exposure to current and former patients alone." He stopped. "It's substantial." She thought about a hospital that had been quietly leaking for 8 years without knowing it, about the staff who'd worked in it, the patients who'd been treated in it, the complete ordinary daily reality of a medical institution operating in good faith while something ran underneath it that none of them had chosen and none of them had known about. She thought about the specific anger that came with that. Not hot, not dramatic, but the cold, sustained kind that comes from understanding that a structure you trusted had been compromised at a level below your visibility. "Is Teal cooperating?" she asked. "With the energy of someone who wants to significantly reduce his exposure," Vaught said. "He'll provide everything." The call ended. She set the phone down on the break room table and looked at the wall for a moment. The wall had a motivational poster on it, the kind that appears in institutional break rooms without anyone specifically choosing it, something about teamwork and a mountain. She had looked at that poster probably 60 times in 12 weeks without processing the image. She processed it now, briefly, and it did not improve anything. Tully came in 20 minutes later to make coffee, saw Claire at the table, and sat down across from her without asking. "The operations director," Tully said. "Warren Teal." "You knew him?" "I've been here 11 years. You know everyone eventually." She poured coffee that was better than the overnight batch because it was now late afternoon and someone had made a fresh pot. He was always helpful, very good at facilitating things. External contractors, vendor relationships, systems access. She looked at her cup. I should have found that stranger than I did. You weren't looking for it, Claire said. No. A pause. Neither was anyone else. She looked at Claire directly. 8 years is a long time to be inside something without anyone seeing you. Claire heard the secondary meaning clearly enough. She'd spent 22 months inside something no one had seen, and Tully wasn't drawing the comparison as a criticism. Different situation, Claire said. Somewhat, Tully said. Not entirely. They sat with the coffee in a companionable quiet that had not existed between them 12 weeks ago, when Claire had been a travel nurse who shook and kept to herself, and which existed now because something had moved. Not cleanly, not without cost, but definitively. And both of them could feel the difference. At 7 in the evening, Vought convened a second meeting in the main conference room. This one was larger than the morning session. Department heads, administrative staff, 2 individuals from the Regional Health Authority, the federal agents who remained on site, and Kowalski, who had apparently decided that her role in whatever was about to happen was to ensure the institution's interests were represented by someone with actual institutional knowledge. Claire sat at the table. Not at the end this time, partway down, beside Tully, who had not been specifically invited but who had come anyway and whom nobody had asked to leave. Vought stood at the head of the table and gave a full account. He was methodical and direct and did not soften anything. He described the Draven Protocol operation and its compromise by Callum Bryce. He described the investigation that had been ongoing for 22 months. He described Garrett Lund's role and the evidence he'd retrieved. He described Murch's function as an intelligence conduit and Teal's 8-year operation underneath the hospital's administrative layer. And then he described Claire, who she was, what her service record contained, what the last 22 months had actually been. He was precise about it, not dramatic, not performed, and he didn't editorialize. He laid out the facts and let the room process them. The room processed them with the specific quality of people who have been operating on a significantly incomplete picture and are now watching it fill in. Purcell had gone pale in the way of administrators who understand liability. The Regional Health Authority representatives were taking notes. Several of the department heads were looking at Claire with expressions that she recognized as recalibration. The same thing she'd seen on Holt's face during the bridge collapse, that moment when the map and the territory stopped matching. Holt was at the table. He was listening with the focused attention of someone who had committed to receiving information as it came rather than filtering it through what he already believed. When Vought finished, Purcell said, "What is the hospital's formal exposure here?" Ferris answered that one. The legal and regulatory dimensions, the mandatory reporting, the process for notifying affected patients about the Teal data breach. It was a long answer. Claire listened to it and understood that Hargrove Regional was going to be in the middle of a significant institutional process for months, and that the process was going to be uncomfortable, and that the discomfort was appropriate because the institution had been compromised, and the path back to integrity was not a short one. Then Vought said, "I want to speak to the specific question of how Senior Chief Reeves has been treated in this facility over the last 12 weeks. The room went very still. He did it without accusation. He did it with facts. The triage assignment during the mass casualty event, the credentialing review initiated on incomplete grounds, the formal documentation of her performance during the bridge collapse response, the specific clinical decisions she'd made that the record showed were correct." He cited Holt's own chart notes, which Holt had not apparently realized Vought had reviewed. Holt did not interrupt. He did not look comfortable, but he did not interrupt. "I raise this," Vought said, "not to create institutional liability, but because it is relevant to the broader pattern. Senior Chief Reeves operated in this facility under conditions that were, at minimum, not conducive to her contribution being visible. That needs to be part of how this institution reflects on the last 12 weeks." He sat down. Purcell looked at Holt. Holt looked at the table and then at Claire. "I want to say something on the record," Holt said. He said it to the room, but he was looking at her. "What Vought described, the way the last 12 weeks went, that's on me. The credentialing review and Murch are a separate issue, but the conditions he described before that, the triage assignment, the way I spoke to her in front of the staff, The assumptions I made on day 3 and never revisited? He paused. I own that, and I'm not going to qualify it. The room was quiet. She saved a patient in Bay 4 during the bridge collapse, he said. She made a clinical call that I'm not certain I would have made as quickly, and she made it without standing or support in this department. That patient survived because of her. And she did it while I was busy confirming my own impressions of who she was. Another pause. That's not the kind of doctor I set out to be. Claire looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 12 weeks and about what it cost a person to say something like that in a room full of colleagues and administrators and people who would remember it. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't enough to undo 12 weeks. But it wasn't nothing. Thank you, she said. That was all. 3 days later, in the same conference room, a smaller gathering, Vaught and Ferris and 2 individuals who had flown in from Naval Special Operations Command, Kowalski. Tully, who was apparently going to be present for the significant moments, whether officially invited or not. Lund, who had been discharged from surgical care and was moving carefully but moving. And Holt, who had asked to be included and to whom Vaught had, after a pause, said yes. The formal correction of Andrea Claire Reeves's service record was not a ceremony. It was a process, paperwork, signatures, the bureaucratic mechanics of correcting a significant official error. But Vaught made something of it anyway, because he believed it warranted being made into something. He read her record. Not all of it. The classified components stayed classified, but the shape of it, the deployment history, the certifications, the commendations, the Draven protocol operation, and what she had done at the extraction point, and the fact that the deviation from the primary corridor that had saved her life had also been the deviation that positioned her to identify the team's compromised route and provide the post-incident analysis that became the foundation of Lund's eventual investigation. She had, Vaught said, survived the operation by making a correct tactical judgment in conditions that did not allow for deliberation. She had then spent 22 months rebuilding herself in conditions that did not allow for acknowledgement. Both things required a specific kind of strength that was not the loud kind, not the kind that looked like strength from the outside, because it had no audience and no recognition attached to it. The death notation on her record was officially removed. Her rank was restored. Her decorations were reinstated. Tully started clapping before Vaught had fully finished speaking. It was slightly early and somewhat uncoordinated and completely genuine. Kowalski joined her. Then the naval representatives. Then, after a half-second that was visible and that she would always respect him for, Holt. Lund, beside her, didn't clap. He was holding her hand instead, which had happened at some point during Vaught's reading of the record, and neither of them had commented on it, and she wasn't going to start now. She looked at the room, the people in it, the specific quality of what was happening, the fact that this moment existed at all in a physical space she could occupy with her actual name, and felt something that she didn't have immediate language for. Not relief, exactly. Relief implied the bad part was simply over, and it wasn't simply over. She understood that. Teal's case would take months. Bryce's prosecution would take longer. The data breach would unfold in waves across affected patients and personnel and the institution itself. The 3 operators from Draven Protocol, whose families were now being informed of the actual circumstances of their deaths. That truth landing in those households was not a clean or simple thing. What she felt was closer to solidity. The specific sensation of the ground being where you expect it to be when your foot comes down. She had been standing on uncertain ground for 22 months, uncertain in her identity, uncertain in her standing, uncertain in the story she was living inside. And now the ground was where it was supposed to be. She said thank you to the room, briefly and without a speech, because she was not someone who gave speeches, and the moment didn't need one. Afterward, she and Lund sat in the hospital cafeteria because Lund needed to eat, and the cafeteria was available, and neither of them wanted to go far. The food was the quality of hospital cafeteria food, which is to say functional and aggressively unremarkable. He ate anyway. "What are you going to do?" he asked. She'd been thinking about this, about Vaught's comment at 3 a.m, "The door is not closed," and about what the door was too. About the specific skills she'd spent a career building and 22 months using in a context nobody knew about, and what those skills were worth in a context people did know about. "There are hospitals that don't know what to do when a mass casualty event happens," she said. Not because they're incompetent, because nobody has ever taught them what they need to know. The military develops frameworks for mass casualty response that civilian institutions don't have access to. She looked at the cafeteria around her, the specific ordinary quality of it, the staff on break, the patient in a wheelchair near the window, the whole apparatus of a place dedicated to addressing human damage. Someone should be building that bridge. He looked at her. That's a program. It's a gap, she said. A program would fill it. You'd need institutional support. I know people, she said. He almost smiled. The close, tired version of it that was all he currently had the energy for. You know one person. Vought has contacts across 6 regional hospital networks. He told me that this morning. She looked at Lund. He also told me that the Navy would support a consultancy model. Former Special Operations medical personnel working directly with civilian trauma centers. Training, protocol development, disaster response system design. That's not small, he said. No, she said. It's not. She looked at her coffee. It was better than the break room coffee, which was a low bar, but better. You went into that compound alone, she said, for 11 days. For people you never met. For a woman you'd only tracked through a nursing license in Wyoming. He didn't say anything. What were you going to do if you came out and found nothing? She asked. If the records hadn't been there. He thought about it honestly. Go back in, he said. She looked at him. I wasn't going to stop, he said. I'd been working it for 8 months. I wasn't going to stop because the first location didn't have what I needed. A pause. I don't know if that's admirable or just stubborn. Both, she said. Yeah, he said. Probably. They sat in the cafeteria for another 30 minutes, which was longer than either of them needed to be there, and which neither of them moved to end. Outside the cafeteria windows, the Wyoming sky was doing what it had been threatening to do for days. Not the clear cold of the last week, but something darker, a real storm coming, the clouds massing in the way that meant actual weather rather than the teasing of it. By the time they left, the first snow was beginning. March snow in Wyoming, wet and serious, the kind that accumulates fast. She drove Lund back to the extended stay property the federal team had arranged for his recovery because he was in no condition to drive and Birch had been reassigned. She drove in the snow without difficulty. She'd been driving in this country's weather for 12 weeks, and before that had driven in worse. Lund fell asleep in the passenger seat 20 minutes in, which she considered a good sign. People in serious pain don't sleep easily. The fact that he could meant something. She thought, driving, about what strength actually was. Not the version she'd seen performed, not the volume of it, not the credentials of it, not the visibility. The version she'd lived for 22 months in a motel room and an emergency department and a classified operation where 3 people died and she didn't. Strength was continuing when the reason for continuing wasn't obvious. Strength was doing the work correctly when nobody was watching and nobody would reward it, and the person most likely to notice was the one who'd decided before day 3 what you were worth. She thought about a woman who had once been declared dead by the institution she'd served, who had rebuilt herself in the space between one identity and another, who had spent 12 weeks being called a rotating body by a man who couldn't read a room, and who had walked out of that room with the truth intact. The truth was always intact. That was the thing nobody told you. You could be dismissed, misread, underestimated, written off, officially classified as something you weren't. The truth about what you were capable of continued to exist regardless. It waited. It was patient in the way that facts are patient, indifferent to whether anyone is currently acknowledging them. She had not changed the truth by going to Silver Falls. She had not earned it back by surviving the compound or stabilizing Garrett Lund or holding position in a trauma corridor at 4 in the morning. The truth had been there the whole time. She had simply waited long enough for the world to catch up to it. She pulled into the property, parked, and sat for a moment in the running vehicle while the snow came down. Lund stirred. "We're here," she said. He looked out the window at the snow. "It's March," he said, with the specific Wyoming newcomer indignation of someone who had not fully internalized the regional weather patterns. "It's Wyoming," she said. He didn't argue with that. Inside, she got him settled. The particular logistical management of ensuring someone with a recent chest surgery doesn't do anything that undoes the last 48 hours of medical intervention. And then sat at the small table in the kitchen with her phone and a notepad and began writing down what a training program for civilian mass casualty response would actually need to contain. Not a proposal. She wasn't ready for a proposal yet. Just the framework, the bones of it. The thing that existed in her head from years of operational experience and 12 weeks of watching a civilian institution respond to acute crises with tools that had been designed for different conditions. She wrote for 2 hours. The snow continued outside. At some point, Lund appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking marginally better than he had, and she made coffee without asking, and he sat across from her and read what she'd written without commenting until he'd finished. "This is real," he said. "I know." "How long to build it?" She thought. 18 months to a functional pilot, 3 years to scale. "What do you need to start?" She looked at him across the kitchen table in the property in Silver Falls, Wyoming, with the snow outside and the coffee between them and a notepad full of the beginning of something that hadn't existed before tonight. "A phone call to Vought," she said, "and time." He slid her phone across the table toward her. She picked it up, set it down. "Not yet. Not tonight. Tonight was for the framework, for getting the bones right before anyone else saw them. Vought would still be available tomorrow. The program would still need building tomorrow. The 3 operators from Draven Protocol, whose families were now facing a truth that was hard but true, they would still deserve the knowledge that something meaningful had come from what was done to them. There was time. For the first time in 22 months, there was time. She picked up the pen instead and kept writing. Outside, the storm moved through Silver Falls the way Wyoming storms do, without apology and without schedule, covering the roads and the parking lots and the hospital building on the north end of town, covering the compound 70 miles northwest where federal investigators were still working through physical evidence, covering the extended stay motel on Route 9 where room 114 sat empty now, its window facing a parking lot that no longer needed watching. By morning, the snow would stop. The roads would clear. The sky would return to the particular pale Wyoming clarity of a late winter day after weather has moved through and taken everything unnecessary with it. And Andrea Claire Reeves, senior chief, combat medic, travel nurse, woman who had been declared dead and had declined to stay that way, would make her phone call, and the work would begin. She had never needed anyone to believe in what she was capable of. She had only needed to remain capable of it long enough for the truth to become impossible to ignore. It had taken 22 months. It had taken a bridge collapse in a compound and a trauma corridor at 4 in the morning. It had taken Garrett Lund spending 11 days in a room to find something worth finding, and 3 operators who deserved to have their story told correctly, and 1 charge nurse who locked a door when asked without needing to know why. It had taken all of it, and it was enough. It was exactly enough. At 7 in the evening, Vought convened a second meeting in the main conference room. This one was larger than the morning session. Department heads, administrative staff, 2 individuals from the Regional Health Authority, the federal agents who remained on site, and Kowalski, who had apparently decided that her role in whatever was about to happen was to ensure the institution's interests were represented by someone with actual institutional knowledge. Claire sat at the table. Not at the end this time. Partway down, beside Tully, who had not been specifically invited but who had come anyway and whom nobody had asked to leave. Vought stood at the head of the table and gave a full account. He was methodical and direct and did not soften anything. He described the Draven Protocol operation and its compromise by Callum Bryce. He described the investigation that had been ongoing for 22 months. He described Garrett Lund's role in the evidence he'd retrieved. He described Murch's function as an intelligence conduit and Teal's 8-year operation underneath the hospital's administrative layer. And then he described Claire, who she was, what her service record contained, what the last 22 months had actually been. He was precise about it, not dramatic, not performed, and he didn't editorialize. He laid out the facts and let the room process them. The room processed them with the specific quality of people who have been operating on a significantly incomplete picture and are now watching it fill in. Purcell had gone pale in the way of administrators who understand liability. The Regional Health Authority representatives were taking notes. Several of the department heads were looking at Claire with expressions that she recognized as recalibration. The same thing she'd seen on Holt's face during the bridge collapse, that moment when the map and the territory stopped matching. Holt was at the table. He was listening with the focused attention of someone who had committed to receiving information as it came rather than filtering it through what he already believed. When Vought finished, Purcell said, What is the hospital's formal exposure here? Ferris answered that one. The legal and regulatory dimensions, the mandatory reporting, the process for notifying affected patients about the Teal data breach. It was a long answer. Claire listened to it and understood that Hargrove Regional was going to be in the middle of a significant institutional process for months, and that the process was going to be uncomfortable, and that the discomfort was appropriate because the institution had been compromised and the path back to integrity was not a short one. Then Vaught said, I want to speak to the specific question of how Senior Chief Reeves has been treated in this facility over the last 12 weeks. The room went very still. He did it without accusation. He did it with facts. The triage assignment during the mass casualty event. The credentialing review initiated on incomplete grounds. The formal documentation of her performance during the bridge collapse response. The specific clinical decisions she'd made that the record showed were correct. He cited Holt's own chart notes, which Holt had not apparently realized Vaught had reviewed. Holt did not interrupt. He did not look comfortable, but he did not interrupt. I raise this, Vaught said, not to create institutional liability, but because it is relevant to the broader pattern. Senior Chief Reeves operated in this facility under conditions that were, at minimum, not conducive to her contribution being visible. That needs to be part of how this institution reflects on the last 12 weeks. He sat down. Purcell looked at Holt. Holt looked at the table and then at Claire. I want to say something on the record, Holt said. He said it to the room, but he was looking at her. What Vaught described, the way the last 12 weeks went, that's on me. The credentialing review and merch are a separate issue, but the conditions he described before that, the triage assignment, the way I spoke to her in front of the staff, the assumptions I made on day 3 and never revisited, he paused. I own that, and I'm not going to qualify it. The room was quiet. She saved a patient in Bay 4 during the bridge collapse, he said. She made a clinical call that I'm not certain I would have made as quickly, and she made it without standing or support in this department. That patient survived because of her, and she did it while I was busy confirming my own impressions of who she was. Another pause. That's not the kind of doctor I set out to be. Claire looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 12 weeks, and about what it cost a person to say something like that in a room full of colleagues and administrators and people who would remember it. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't enough to undo 12 weeks, but it wasn't nothing. Thank you, she said. That was all. 3 days later, in the same conference room, a smaller gathering. Vaught and Ferris and 2 individuals who had flown in from Naval Special Operations Command. Kowalski. Tully, who was apparently going to be present for the significant moments, whether officially invited or not. Lund, who had been discharged from surgical care and was moving carefully but moving. And Holt, who had asked to be included and to whom Vaught had, after a pause, said yes. The formal correction of Andrea Claire Reeves's service record was not a ceremony. It was a process. Paperwork, signatures, the bureaucratic mechanics of correcting a significant official error. But Vaught made something of it anyway, because he believed it warranted being made into something. He read her record. Not all of it. The classified components stayed classified. But the shape of it, the deployment history, the certifications, the commendations, the Draven protocol operation, and what she had done at the extraction point, and the fact that the deviation from the primary corridor that had saved her life had also been the deviation that positioned her to identify the team's compromised route and provide the post-incident analysis that became the foundation of Lund's eventual investigation. She had, Vaught said, survived the operation by making a correct tactical judgment in conditions that did not allow for deliberation. She had then spent 22 months rebuilding herself in conditions that did not allow for acknowledgement. Both things required a specific kind of strength that was not the loud kind, not the kind that looked like strength from the outside because it had no audience and no recognition attached to it. The death notation on her record was officially removed. Her rank was restored. Her decorations were reinstated. Tully started clapping before Vaught had fully finished speaking. It was slightly early and somewhat uncoordinated and completely genuine. Kowalski joined her. Then the naval representatives. Then, after a half-second that was visible and that she would always respect him for, Holt. Lund, beside her, didn't clap. He was holding her hand instead, which had happened at some point during Vaught's reading of the record, and neither of them had commented on it, and she wasn't going to start now. She looked at the room, the people in it, the specific quality of what was happening, the fact that this moment existed at all in a physical space she could occupy with her actual name, and felt something that she didn't have immediate language for. Not relief exactly. Relief implied the bad part was simply over, and it wasn't simply over. She understood that. Teal's case would take months, Bryce's prosecution would take longer. The data breach would unfold in waves across affected patients and personnel and the institution itself. The three operators from Draven Protocol, whose families were now being informed of the actual circumstances of their deaths. That truth landing in those households was not a clean or simple thing. What she felt was closer to solidity. The specific sensation of the ground being where you expect it to be when your foot comes down. She had been standing on uncertain ground for 22 months, uncertain in her identity, uncertain in her standing, uncertain in the story she was living inside, and now the ground was where it was supposed to be. She said thank you to the room, briefly and without a speech, because she was not someone who gave speeches, and the moment didn't need one. Afterward, she and Lund sat in the hospital cafeteria because Lund needed to eat, and the cafeteria was available, and neither of them wanted to go far. The food was the quality of hospital cafeteria food, which is to say functional and aggressively unremarkable. He ate anyway. "What are you going to do?" he asked. She'd been thinking about this, about Vaught's comment at 3 a.m, "The door is not closed," and about what the door was too. About the specific skills she'd spent a career building and 22 months using in a context nobody knew about, and what those skills were worth in a context people did know about. "There are hospitals that don't know what to do when a mass casualty event happens," she said. "Not because they're incompetent, because nobody has ever taught them what they need to know. The military develops frameworks for mass casualty response that civilian institutions don't have access to." She looked at the cafeteria around her, the specific ordinary quality of it, the staff on break, the patient in a wheelchair near the window, the whole apparatus of a place dedicated to addressing human damage. Someone should be building that bridge. He looked at her. "That's a program." "It's a gap," she said. "A program would fill it. You'd need institutional support." "I know people," she said. He almost smiled, the close, tired version of it that was all he currently had the energy for. "You know one person. Vaught has contacts across 6 regional hospital networks. He told me that this morning." She looked at Lund. "He also told me that the Navy would support a consultancy model. Former Special Operations medical personnel working directly with civilian trauma centers. Training, protocol development, disaster response system design. That's not small," he said. "No," she said, "it's not." She looked at her coffee. It was better than the break room coffee, which was a low bar, but better. "You went into that compound alone," she said, "for 11 days. For people you never met. For a woman you'd only tracked through a nursing license in Wyoming." He didn't say anything. "What were you going to do if you came out and found nothing?" she asked. "If the records hadn't been there." He thought about it honestly. "Go back in," he said. She looked at him. "I wasn't going to stop," he said. "I'd been working it for 8 months. I wasn't going to stop because the first location didn't have what I needed." A pause. "I don't know if that's admirable or just stubborn." "Both," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Probably." They sat in the cafeteria for another 30 minutes, which was longer than either of them needed to be there, and which neither of them moved to end. Outside the cafeteria windows, the Wyoming sky was doing what it had been threatening to do for days. Not the clear cold of the last week, but something darker, a real storm coming, the clouds massing in the way that meant actual weather rather than the teasing of it. By the time they left, the first snow was beginning. March snow in Wyoming, wet and serious, the kind that accumulates fast. She drove Lund back to the extended stay property the federal team had arranged for his recovery, because he was in no condition to drive and Birch had been reassigned. She drove in the snow without difficulty. She'd been driving in this country's weather for 12 weeks, and before that had driven in worse. Lund fell asleep in the passenger seat 20 minutes in, which she considered a good sign. People in serious pain don't sleep easily. The fact that he could meant something. She thought, driving, about what strength actually was. Not the version she'd seen performed, not the volume of it, not the credentials of it, not the visibility. The version she'd lived for 22 months in a motel room and an emergency department and a classified operation where 3 people died and she didn't. Strength was continuing when the reason for continuing wasn't obvious. Strength was doing the work correctly when nobody was watching and nobody would reward it. And the person most likely to notice was the one who'd decided before day 3 what you were worth. She thought about a woman who had once been declared dead by the institution she'd served, who had rebuilt herself in the space between one identity and another, who had spent 12 weeks being called a rotating body by a man who couldn't read a room, and who had walked out of that room with the truth intact. The truth was always intact. That was the thing nobody told you. You could be dismissed, misread, underestimated, written off, officially classified as something you weren't. The truth about what you were capable of continued to exist regardless. It waited. It was patient in the way that facts are patient, indifferent to whether anyone is currently acknowledging them. She had not changed the truth by going to Silver Falls. She had not earned it back by surviving the compound or stabilizing Garrett Lund or holding position in a trauma corridor at 4 in the morning. The truth had been there the whole time. She had simply waited long enough for the world to catch up to it. She pulled into the property, parked, and sat for a moment in the running vehicle while the snow came down. Lund stirred. "We're here," she said. He looked out the window at the snow. "It's March," he said, with the specific Wyoming newcomer indignation of someone who had not fully internalized the regional weather patterns. "It's Wyoming," she said. He didn't argue with that. Inside, she got him settled. The particular logistical management of ensuring someone with a recent chest surgery doesn't do anything that undoes the last 48 hours of medical intervention. And then sat at the small table in the kitchen with her phone and a notepad and began writing down what a training program for civilian mass casualty response would actually need to contain. Not a proposal. She wasn't ready for a proposal yet. Just the framework. The bones of it. The thing that existed in her head from years of operational experience and 12 weeks of watching a civilian institution respond to acute crises with tools that had been designed for different conditions. She wrote for 2 hours. The snow continued outside. At some point, Lund appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking marginally better than he had, and she made coffee without asking, and he sat across from her and read what she'd written without commenting until he'd finished. "This is real," he said. "I know." "How long to build it?" She thought. 18 months to a functional pilot, 3 years to scale. "What do you need to start?" She looked at him across the kitchen table in the property in Silver Falls, Wyoming, with the snow outside and the coffee between them and a notepad full of the beginning of something that hadn't existed before tonight. "A phone call to Vought," she said, "and time." He slid her phone across the table toward her. She picked it up, set it down. "Not yet. Not tonight. Tonight was for the framework, for getting the bones right before anyone else saw them. Vought would still be available tomorrow. The program would still need building tomorrow. The 3 operators from Draven Protocol, whose families were now facing a truth that was hard but true, they would still deserve the knowledge that something meaningful had come from what was done to them. There was time. For the first time in 22 months, there was time. She picked up the pen instead and kept writing. Outside, the storm moved through Silver Falls the way Wyoming storms do, without apology and without schedule, covering the roads and the parking lots and the hospital building on the north end of town, covering the compound 70 miles northwest where federal investigators were still working through physical evidence, covering the extended stay motel on Route 9 where room 114 sat empty now, its window facing a parking lot that no longer needed watching. By morning, the snow would stop. The roads would clear. The sky would return to the particular pale Wyoming clarity of a late winter day after weather has moved through and taken everything unnecessary with it. And Andrea Claire Reeves, senior chief, combat medic, travel nurse, woman who had been declared dead and had declined to stay that way, would make her phone call, and the work would begin. She had never needed anyone to believe in what she was capable of. She had only needed to remain capable of it long enough for the truth to become impossible to ignore. It had taken 22 months. It had taken a bridge collapse and a compound in a trauma corridor at 4 in the morning. It had taken Garrett Lund spending 11 days in a room to find something worth finding, and 3 operators who deserved to have their story told correctly, and 1 charge nurse who locked a door when asked without needing to know why. It had taken all of it, and it was enough. It was